Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 362 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. I have a cartridge comparison for you today on two completely different rounds, the .308 Winchester and the .45-70 Government. I can hear a bunch of people probably thinking to themselves right now, John, why the heck are you even comparing these two rounds? This isn't apples and oranges, this is comparing strawberries to pineapples. And that's a fair question. Now, comparing these two cartridges is a great example of how a person who doesn't know any better can get a wildly distorted view of how two cartridges compare to each other by simply looking at their performance on paper. Now, while they may look very similar at first glance in certain performance categories, especially muzzle energy, the .308 and the .45-70 are two completely different rounds, ideally suited for very different hunting situations. The ammo available in these cartridges is different. Same thing for the rifles available in them, and on and on and on. Now, funny enough, I have both a .308 and a .45-70. I have hunted extensively with both cartridges, and I really like each one, but my affinity for each one is for different reasons, and I use them for different tasks. So in this episode, I compare the .45-70 and the .308 in detail so you can decide which one will work best for your individual needs. We will discuss the overall design characteristics and performance specs of both the .308 and the .45-70, then we'll compare how they stack up next to each other. And I'll also share how they each perform in some ballistic gel tests. Some of these results were very interesting. Before we get into that, I would greatly appreciate it if you would complete a listener survey of the Big Game Hunting Podcast and provide some feedback about the show, what you like about it, what topics you want covered in the future, what guests you want me to have on the show, etc. Your responses will help me plan future episodes to help me give you more of what you want in the future. And everyone who completes the survey by 23 March 2025 will be entered in a random drawing for a $50 Cabela's gift card. Link for the survey is in the show notes. Also, make sure you are on my email list. If you like the podcast, you will love the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. Sign up at the link in the show notes or at biggamehuntingpodcast.com/ebook. As usual, we'll start with a brief history of both rounds and what they were designed for. I'll begin with the .45-70, which actually got its start with the U.S. Army and the then-new Springfield Model 1873 rifle. Best known as the Trapdoor Springfield, this rifle debuted with a new .45 caliber cartridge using a powder charge of 70 grains of black powder in a copper case. This was a revolutionary new leap forward in cartridge design at the time. Now, the Army used a couple of different loads firing either a 405 grain or a 500 grain bullet for the cartridge. Now, these performance specifications are where the name of the .45-70 Government cartridge comes from. The standard naming convention in common use at the time consisted of the caliber of the cartridge followed by the standard load of powder in grains. That cartridge was designed at the U.S. government-operated Springfield Armory, fired either that 405 or 500 grain .45 caliber bullet propelled by 70 grains of black powder. The cartridge received the designation .45-70 405 or .45-70 500, depending on the exact load. Eventually, they dropped the 405 and the 500 from the name, and the name .45-70 Government stuck with the round. Now, the original black powder .45-70 load pushed a cast lead bullet at about 1,350 feet per second, 405 grain bullet. Now, the 1873 Springfield and the .45-70 served as the primary service rifle and cartridge used by the U.S. Army in the late 1800s until the much more modern bolt-action Springfield 1892 Craig Jorgensen rifle chambered in .30-40 Krag eventually replaced it. Now, sportsmen in the U.S. also developed an affinity for the .45-70 after the Army adopted the round. So for that reason, civilian rifle manufacturers also soon began churning out rifles in .45-70 for hunters and shooters to use. Now, while those original black powder 4570 loads do not have very impressive ballistics by modern standards, the cartridge was quite effective on the whole spectrum of North American game, ranging from white-tailed deer and black bear all the way up to larger, tougher, and sometimes more dangerous game like moose, grizzly bear, and bison. The 4570 dropped off in popularity and nearly disappeared completely in the early 20th century, but it saw a major resurgence in the second half of the 1900s. Even though it was originally designed for use with black powder, modern production 4570 rifles with stronger actions can safely utilize more powerful loads utilizing smokeless powder for the cartridge. Those developments, combined with the introduction of just better quality bullets, have further improved the performance of the 4570 and have breathed new life into the old cartridge. Now let's shift gears a little and talk about the 308. Similar to the 4570, the 308 Winchester story begins with a search by the U.S. military for a new rifle cartridge. In this case, the U.S. Army was looking for a new .30 caliber round that would duplicate the performance of the 30-06, but out of a smaller package. They eventually settled on the 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO round. Winchester quickly adopted that cartridge for civilian use and released it to the world as the 308 Winchester in 1952. Now, to be clear, the 30-06 is still a more powerful cartridge than the 308 and the 7.62 by 51, but the 308 is a more efficient round, same with the 7.62, but we're talking about the 308 here. The 308 is a more efficient round and can generally shoot the same weight bullet at a muzzle velocity about 100 feet per second slower than the 30-06 can. But the 308 can achieve that level of performance out of a significantly smaller package that fits in a handier short-action rifle, doesn't need as long of a barrel for optimum performance, and has less recoil. The 30-06 remains quite popular to this day, but the 308 Winchester has steadily grown in popularity since the 1950s, and it is also now one of the most popular centerfire rifle cartridges in the world among both hunters and recreational shooters. So we've established the 4570 and the 308 have very different origin stories, but how do they compare to each other in more practical terms? Well, to start off with, they have almost completely different external dimensions. The 4570 uses a very large diameter straight wall case with a rim. On the other hand, the 308 is physically a little longer overall, but uses a rimless, bottlenecked case design that is much smaller in diameter than the 4570 case. We'll discuss this in more detail later, but realize those differences in case design heavily influence the rifles each cartridge is available in. All told, the 308 Winchester has a longer cartridge overall length than the 4570. Heck, just the 308 Winchester case is nearly as long as the entire 4570 cartridge. However, the 4570 does have that much larger diameter case. As I mentioned earlier, the 4570 utilizes a straight-walled design with no shoulder and very little body taper. This is in stark contrast to the 308, which is not nearly as large in those respects. It starts off smaller in diameter at the base, has a little bit of taper, and then has a 20-degree shoulder on the case, which the 4570 lacks. All told, the 4570 can hold an astounding 55% more powder than the 308. Bullet weight and bullet diameter are two other important differences between these cartridges. The 308 Winchester utilizes .308-inch diameter bullets, while the 4570 utilizes much larger .458-inch bullets. In that vein, the 308 typically has bullet weights in the 110 to 180 grain range. 150, 165, 168, and 180 grain bullets tend to be most popular. Now, it is certainly possible to find 4570 ammo utilizing bullets weighing as little as 250 grains and as heavy as 540 grains, and possibly even more and less in each case. Most 4570 factory loads use 300, 325, 350, or 405 grain bullets. Finally, the 308 is also loaded to a much higher SAAMI maximum average pressure of 62,000 psi versus 28,000 psi for the 4570. This is because the 308 was designed from the start to use smokeless powder, while the 4570 was originally designed for black powder before being adopted to use smokeless powder many years later. Now, the 4570 is a much older cartridge, and there is a wide range of rifles manufactured in that chambering. For that reason, ammunition manufacturers will often produce ammunition in different power levels for use in different rifles. The same is also true for hand load. In terms of factory ammo, usually you'll see every now and then some very low-powered stuff that is safe to use in a trapdoor Springfield, and then everything else is safe to use in, say, an 1886, an 1895, whatever. Companies like Buffalo Bore will go an extra step and sometimes make an even more powerful loading for the 4570 that's only safe to use in rifles with very strong actions like a Ruger No. 1. The hand loading situation is similar. My Lyman 50th edition reloading manual specifies 3 different categories of 4570 hand loads. Lower pressure loads safe for use in a trapdoor Springfield, maximum pressures up to 18,000 CUP. Those safe to use in stronger Marlin 1895 and Winchester 1886 rifles, maximum pressures up to 28,000 CUP, and those safe to use in the single-shot Ruger No. 1, maximum pressures up to 40,000 CUP. Even when you take that into account, even when you're comparing the really, really hot stuff that you can use in a really strong action 4570 rifle, the 308 is still designed to operate at a much higher pressure than the 4570. So yeah, these cartridges are very different in all of those respects in terms of their dimensions, their pressure levels, how much powder they can accommodate, all of that stuff. So how does that translate into ballistics? Well, let's compare a couple different loads from the Hornady Lever Evolution and Precision Hunter, Barnes Vortex, and Remington Core-Lock lines for the 4570 and 308. In this case, I'll use 308 loads with a 150 grain TTSX, .440 BC, a 180 grain Core-Lock, .383 BC, and a 178 grain ELDX bullet, .552 BC. For the 4570, we'll utilize 300 grain TSX bullets, .163 BC, 405 grain Core-Lock bullets, .281 BC, and 325 grain FTX bullets, .230 BC. Note that the various bullets used in all those 308 Winchester loads have much higher ballistic coefficients than those used in the various 4570 loads. The Barnes loads use light for caliber bullets. The Hornady ammo loads use heavier and higher BC bullets for each cartridge, and the Core-Lock loads use the heaviest bullets available for each cartridge that are commonly available in factory loads. It's also worth noting that Remington Core-Lock load for the 4570 is a very low-powered loading that mimics the original ballistics of the cartridge and is safe to use in a trapdoor Springfield. Now, those two cartridges actually start out fairly evenly matched in the energy department, with the low-velocity 405 grain 4570 load being a notable exception. The 325 4570 load has the most muzzle energy, then it's followed closely by the 150, 180, and 178 grain 308 loads, then the 300 grain 4570 load, then finally we have that real low-powered 405 grain 4570 load bringing up the rear. While all of the 308 loads start out going considerably faster than the 4570 loads, the 4570 utilizes much heavier bullets. That works to even things out in the energy department at first. Things rapidly change as we go downrange, though. Indeed, the 308 quickly leaves the 4570 in the dust in both the trajectory and retained energy departments. That's because the 308 utilizes much more aerodynamic bullets pushed at a significantly faster velocity. The 308 doesn't have a reputation for being an extremely flat shooting round if you compare it to something like a 30-06, 270, 300 Win Mag, etc., but it is still a modern high-velocity cartridge. Even the fastest 4570 loads cannot hold a candle to the 308 in this area. Depending on the specific loads compared, the 308 has a velocity advantage ranging from about 600 to nearly 1,500 feet per second. So not only does it start out going quite a bit faster, but those much more aerodynamic bullets hang on to velocity and energy much better than those used by the 4570. Every 308 load has more, and sometimes significantly more, retained energy than every 4570 load in this comparison by the time they reach the 100-yard mark. That advantage continues to grow as the range increases. The differences are even more stark in terms of trajectory. The 4570 is the definition of a lower velocity cartridge with a very rainbow-like trajectory. If you're comparing these cartridges with a 100-yard zero, even the most arcing 308 load has less than half of the bullet drop at 200 yards than the flattest shooting 4570 load. So the big takeaways so far are the two cartridges start out with generally very similar muzzle velocity levels, aside from the real slow 4570 load with the 405 grain bullet, but the 308 is much flatter shooting and retains much more energy as ranges increase. The 180 grain core lock load for the 308 has the least retained energy of all the 308 loads, and it still has 30% more retained energy at 200 yards than the 4570. So yeah, the 4570 starts out really well, good up close, but it really drops off as the range increases, and it happens fast. Now let's talk about another important factor, wind. Once again, the 308 blows the 4570 out of the water here too. That's because the 308 Winchester just fires much higher BC bullets at a much faster velocity. Velocity and BC are both important inputs into calculating wind deflection, but BC is especially important here. That's why the 178 grain ELDX for the 308 Winchester performs so much better than everything else on this list. That's also why the 405 grain 4570 load actually has less wind deflection than the faster 325 grain 4570 load, because even though it's going so much slower, that 405 grain bullet actually does have a higher BC. But now let's talk about recoil. The 4570 has a lot more recoil than the 308 when you compare the 178 and 325 grain loads for each one out of an 8-pound rifle. That's because the 4570 fires a much heavier bullet and utilizes a lot more powder to achieve that performance. In this particular case, the 4570 has about 70% more free recoil energy than the 308. Now, while that's probably towards the upper end of what a typical hunter or shooter can handle, we're still not talking about 458 Win Mag or a 338 Lapua performance here either, but it's still stout. There are a couple of other factors we need to discuss. First, the 4570 uses much larger diameter bullets than the 308 Winchester. Specifically, those bullets have about 121% more frontal surface area than the smaller bullets the 308 uses. All other things being equal, a bigger bullet will make a bigger hole, cause more tissue damage, and result in more blood loss. But, and this is a big but, all other things are not equal. Yes, the 4570 shoots much larger diameter bullets, but the 308 is pushing those projectiles much faster. Velocity is a very important input as well when you're talking about terminal performance and how much damage a bullet will inflict upon a medium. It is tough to make a true apples-to-apples comparison here because there's not a lot of overlap in bullet types between the 308 and the 4570. But I'll give a couple of examples of how several different loads performed relative to each other in gel though. First, I shot a Winchester Super X load for both cartridges. The 4570 utilizes a 300 grain jacketed hollow point in that lineup. The 308 uses a 180 grain soft point bullet. So yes, they're not exactly the same bullet, but they are each a simple cup and core projectile for each one made by the same company. In this case, the 4570 made a slightly larger diameter wound. The 308 also produced an impressive wound in this case, but it was definitely smaller than the one the 4570 made. Both projectiles made pretty long wound cavities overall. Neither produced an exaggerated football-shaped wound cavity you see sometimes where not much happens, then it gets super wide for a couple of inches, and then it quickly narrows back down to much more narrow. No, both made somewhat wide wounds that very gradually tapered off as it went like 10 to 15 inches farther into the gel. In this case, the 308 load penetrated about 15% deeper overall. I have also tested the 4570 shooting the 325 grain FTX bullet out of the Hornady Lever Evolution line. There's no real comparable 308 load here, right? They don't offer the FTX bullet in a factory load for the 308 Winchester. But for comparison's sake, I have shot a 150 grain tipped core lock load for the 308. Yes, I know it's not the same, but it is another polymer tipped cup and core bullet. It is a little bit tougher than the FTX, but it is also designed for use at a much higher velocity than the FTX bullet is as well. Now, this 4570 Lever Evolution load performed fantastically, made a very wide wound, really penetrated deep. This is actually the best performing 4570 load I have shot in gel in terms of both the depth of penetration and the width of the wound cavity it performed. And yes, it was a little bit wider than the wound cavity the 308 produced here. Now, interestingly, the 325 grain FTX also penetrated better than the 150 grain core lock tipped for the 308. That's about 7 inches deeper in this particular case. That's about just under 30 inches deeper penetration. Now, that 325 FTX is a spicy load for the 4570. I shot it out of a Marlin 1895 with a 24-inch long barrel. That's a very long barrel for the 4570. I was generating over 2,000 feet per second of muzzle velocity out of it. There are very few factory loads available for the 4570 that shoot that fast. I have also shot a 300 grain Barnes TSX bullet out of the 4570. That load penetrated very well, but delivered a more narrow wound track than everything else I've talked about, to include both 308 loads. So with all of that in mind, yes, the 4570 is probably going to give you a wider wound cavity than the 308. It will also probably penetrate better. This is likely in large part due to the larger diameter bullets the cartridge uses, along with the fact that those really heavy bullets just have so much momentum. But larger wounds and deeper penetration are not guaranteed. Some 308 loads will make a larger wound. Some will also penetrate better. It really just depends on the exact bullets you're talking about for each one. But even in the cases where one did better than the other, there wasn't a gigantic difference in terms of the wound size that they each made. Now, the 308 is a more efficient cartridge, and it can fling a higher BC bullet at a faster velocity without generating as much recoil as the 4570. It can also deliver good performance on game at a much longer range than the 4570 too. So the end result is the 308 is a cartridge that offers advantages in trajectory and wind deflection with light to moderate recoil that can assist the shooter in shot placement. That brings me to my next point, which is accuracy. I have to give the edge to the 308 Winchester in this area. I'm not saying the 4570 isn't capable of great accuracy. My Marlin 1895 shoots great. That rifle actually is capable of a little bit better accuracy than my old Winchester Model 70 featherweight in 308. But that Model 70 has really been around the block a few times. It's been shot a lot. Accuracy is not terrible with it, but it is one of the least accurate rifles I own. I think this is an example of the exception proving the rule, though. On average, the 308 has better accuracy potential with factory rifles and ammunition. Plus, it's also just more commonly available in bolt-action rifles, which are generally more accurate than lever-action rifles, where the 4570 is most common. So where do we stand overall? The 308 Winchester fires smaller diameter, lighter, and higher BC bullets at a much faster velocity than the 4570. The 4570 generally has more kinetic energy at close range, along with significantly more recoil, but the 308 has a much flatter trajectory, better resistance to wind deflection, and much better energy retention at longer range. All right, now let's talk about rifles and ammo available for each one. Both cartridges are popular among hunters and shooters in the USA, but the 4570 cannot hold a candle to the 308 in terms of raw ammo sales, though. For example, Midway USA currently lists 164 308 Winchester ammo offerings compared to just 4570 for the 4570 as I record this. So I wouldn't say 4570 ammo is especially rare, but there's just a lot more options for the 308. In general, 308 ammo is often cheaper than 4570 ammo too. There are also a couple of other important differences in types of ammo available for each cartridge. For example, there are many cases where you can find both cartridges in the same ammo line, right? Winchester Super X, Remington Core Lock, both good examples. Both are good deer hunting ammo choices for each cartridge. But there are examples of lines where you have one cartridge but not the other. For instance, since the 4570 is most common in lever-action rifles with tubular magazines, most loads feature a round-nosed or flat-tipped bullets. This is because bullets are stacked one on top of the other in that tubular magazine, and recoil could potentially cause a bullet with a pointed tip to detonate the primer of the cartridge in front of it. Unfortunately, those round or flat-nosed bullets have a very low BC, and they have poor downrange performance. The upside is those bullets tend to perform well on game and deliver excellent terminal performance. Designers at Hornady attempted to remedy that problem with their Lever Evolution line of ammo for cartridges like the 4570. This ammo is loaded with bullets that have a pointed, flexible polymer tip. It doesn't turn a 4570 into a 300 Win Mag, but that ammo still uses a more aerodynamic bullet and also often has a higher velocity than typical ammo for the 4570. So this ammo does have a slightly flatter trajectory, slightly increased effective range, and retains more energy at typical hunting ranges than your normal 4570 ammo. Those polymer tips also help initiate expansion upon impact. They also tend to deliver devastating terminal performance on all manner of game. The situation is very different with the 308, though. Most 308 loads use pointed bullets because it's so much more common in bolt-action rifles. Speaking of rifles, the rifle availability situation is similar to the ammo situation. You got lots more rifles in 308 than in 4570. As I record this, Sportsman's Warehouse lists 493 308 Winchester rifles on their website compared to 36 4570 rifles. Going beyond the sheer numbers of rifles available in each round, there's also a big split in the types of rifles available in each one. This is another significant difference between these two cartridges. Since it is a rimmed cartridge, the 4570 is most commonly, though not exclusively, chambered in single-shot and lever-action rifles. On the other hand, the rimless 308 is widely available in bolt-action and semi-auto rifles. You can also get it in a few lever-action rifles like the Browning BLR, the Winchester 88, and the Savage Model 99. All of those rifles use a box magazine that presents no safety hazard with a pointed bullet. Going way back into the 1800s, you could get the 4570 in the Springfield 1873, the Remington Keen, the Remington Rolling Block, the Sharps 1874 Buffalo Rifle, the Winchester Hotchkiss, the Winchester Model 1885 Highwall, and the Winchester Model 1886. In addition to older rifles like those that are still available from time to time out there, there are some current production rifles you can get in 4572. First up, the one that comes to mind for me is the Marlin 1895. That's the bigger brother to the Marlin 336. That's probably the single most popular rifle currently manufactured in 4570. Ruger took over production of Marlin rifles a couple years ago, and they are currently producing a pretty wide variety of Marlin lever-action rifles in 4570, along with other chamberings with all sorts of different styles, different barrel lengths, magazine lengths, all sorts of stuff. In addition to Marlin, there are a number of different Henry 4570 lever-action rifles out there. Winchester continues to manufacture a modern version of the legendary lever-action Model 1886. CVA also produces their single-shot Scout rifle in 4570 too. It is no longer in production, but the single-shot Ruger number 1 was available in 4570 for a time as well. And finally, gunsmiths converted some Siamese Mauser bolt-action rifles to 4570 over the years, so they are an option. And off the top of my head, they are the only option for a bolt-action 4570 rifle. The situation is much different for the 308. Winchester originally offered the 308 in their Model 70 bolt action, along with their lever action Model 88 and their semi-automatic Model 100 rifles. They still make the 308 in the Model 70. They also make their newer and lower price point XPR rifle in 308. The same is also true of basically any bolt-action hunting rifle you can think of from darn near any manufacturer today. Remington produces Model 700 rifles in 308. Same is true for the Bergara B14, Browning AB3 and X-Bolt, Mossberg Patriot, the Ruger American, the Ruger Hawkeye, the Savage Axis, the Tikka T3, the Weatherby Vanguard, etc., etc. You can also get a 308 in a semi-automatic rifle, like a Browning automatic rifle or various versions of the so-called AR-10. Same with the M1A from Springfield. What about barrel lengths? This is an area where both cartridges can be all over the board. You can find rifles in both cartridges with a 22-inch long barrel, but those longer 22 and 24-inch long barrels tend to be more common for the 308. But, like I said, you can get shorter barrels for both of them too. And it's not uncommon to see 4570 and 308 rifles with both 16 and 18-inch long barrels. Here's a couple of examples. Marlin produces their 1895 Trapper in 4570 with a very short 16.17-inch long barrel. That is an ultra-compact rifle. It's great for maneuvering through thick brush without too much difficulty, and this gives the user a fast-handling and hard-hitting tool to use at close quarters. Now, they market that rifle for trappers, but it's not limited to just that crowd either. The same virtues that make the 1895 Trapper wonderful for the trapping community also make it a nice rifle for hunters in thick timber, as well as deer hunters in tree stands or ground blinds who need an easy-to-maneuver rifle. But, like I said, 308 rifles are available in compact rifles too. Ruger offers their Hawkeye Compact in 308. That rifle has a 16.5-inch long barrel. It's not quite as small as the 1895 Trapper, but it's close. Now, on the other hand, the 308 Winchester is available in many different rifles that are much better suited for more open country hunts. Winchester's Model 70 Long Range MB falls at the complete opposite end of the spectrum from the Hawkeye Compact and the 1895 Trapper. That rifle has a 24-inch long barrel and an overall length of 44 inches. That is nearly 10 inches longer overall than the Hawkeye Compact. So it is not a compact rifle by any stretch of the imagination, but it's also much better suited for taking a long poke across the prairie at an antelope or a mule deer than any of those other rifles I just mentioned. And of course, you have all kinds of stuff that's in the middle between that 16-inch long barrel and 24-inch long barrel. So which cartridge is right for you? With good shot placement and when using appropriate bullets, the 4570 and 308 are both deadly on medium to large size game. They can cleanly take every species of big game in North America and really elsewhere in the world. But as I've kind of danced around this entire episode, each cartridge has very different strengths and weaknesses, though. So you'll see what I mean more when I dig into the details. Do you primarily hunt medium-sized game like whitetail deer, hogs, or black bear at ranges within 200 yards? Both are incredibly effective in that role. Both are great deer hunting cartridges. Both will get the job done on similar-sized game like hogs and black bear too. Joseph von Benedict used a new production Marlin 1895 and 4570 to take a black bear on a hunt using hounds in Idaho during 2023. Now, a rifle chambered in 308 would have worked great on that hunt too, but conditions like that, where a hunter must potentially trail those hounds for several miles over rough terrain and through thick brush before taking a shot at close range, like Joseph experienced on this hunt, just scream for a handy yet hard-hitting lever gun in something like 4570. Now, both are also great for deer hunting, but the details of exactly where you're hunting and the conditions in that area matter a lot. Funny enough, the 308 and the 4570 were the first two cartridges I killed deer with as a young man, and those two rounds accounted for 4 of my first 5 deer. I killed my first 2 deer, which were both small bucks, with a Winchester Model 70 in 308. I killed my first doe with a Marlin 1895 and 4570. A couple years later, I took a bigger buck using a Remington Model 8 and 32 Remington the following year, but I killed another doe later that same season with a 4570. So that's what I mean with 4 out of my first 5 deer. In each case, I was hunting in the piney woods of East Texas out of deer stands where shots were typically in the 50 to 100 yard range. In other words, these were ideal conditions for a 4570. Both cartridges performed great on all of those hunts, and I have no reservations about using them. None of those animals went more than about 50 yards afterwards either. 2 of those deer went down instantly, one from a 308, one from a 4570. One of the 308s and one of the 4570 shot deer ran a short distance and then tipped over. Now, if you're hunting in more open country where you might need to take a shot at a distance longer than 100 yards, well, the 308 is clearly a better choice here. But what if you're hunting in a different state like Iowa or Ohio that requires you to use a straight-walled cartridge? Well, the bottlenecked 308 is illegal to use in those states, so the 4570 is the better choice in this situation. Now, beware, the 4570 is a legal cartridge in some, but not all, of the so-called straight-walled states. For instance, it is not legal to use the 4570 in southern Michigan, as I record this, because they restrict their hunters to using a 35 caliber or larger straight-walled cartridge with a case length between 1.16 inches and 1.8 inches long. The 4570 fits all of those requirements, except it has a case length that's too long, 2.1 inches in that case. So like I said, the 4570 is legal in many states, but not all of them. So just look at the details before you go hunting. If you must use a straight wall cartridge and you can't use the 4570 where you're deer hunting, look at probably a 350 Legend or a 450 Bushmaster instead. Now, are you looking for a more compact rifle that is better suited for a younger or maybe a more smaller framed hunter? Or maybe you want something that's better for someone that is more recoil shy? In each case, the 308 is definitely the better option. The 308 does have a little more recoil than other cartridges like a 243 or a 6.5 Creedmoor, but it is still an excellent cartridge for new, small-framed, and or recoil-shy hunters. That is especially true when using light recoiling hand loads or certain factory loads. The Hornady Custom Light factory load is a great option for the 308. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I killed my first 2 deer with a 308 Winchester. As a matter of fact, I was pretty young at the time. My dad made some special lighter recoiling hand loads for me for the cartridge. It worked great. It didn't kick a lot. Killed those deer very cleanly. Now, which cartridge is ideal for someone going afield in very thick conditions or who will be hunting from a smaller box blind? Like I mentioned earlier, the overlap in rifles for both cartridges with those shorter barrels means there are actually a surprisingly large number of compact rifles in both rounds. It might be a wash in this area. The better choice for you is probably a matter of personal preference and availability. Both the 308 and the 4570 will work in this area with the right rifle. Are you looking for a cartridge better suited for longer range hunting for game like mule deer or pronghorn in open country where you might need to take a shot at several hundred yards? Well, the 308 is easily the better choice here. It's got a much flatter trajectory, much better resistance to wind deflection, and it just performs much better than the 4570 at extended range. And just due to the nature of the cartridge, it's also a lot easier to hit animals at longer range as well. What about if you want to hunt bigger game, right? Elk, moose, kudu, eland, that sort of thing. Both will work. Lots of people have used them with success on bigger game. That larger frontal diameter of the 4570, combined with its similar retained energy to the 308, at very close range anyway, are definitely helpful when trying to cleanly take a big animal. After all, there is something to be said about the advantages of a cartridge that makes a big hole going in and out of an animal. It's all just a matter of getting close enough to make a good shot with the 4570, though. I'd recommend the 4570 if you were hunting in thicker conditions and you know you won't be taking a shot past 100 yards. Really, that applies to both hunting smaller game like deer as well as bigger game like moose with these cartridges. The 4570 is a devastating choice for even really the biggest game in areas where you can approach them closely. I just mentioned moose. That's a good example. Same is also true for something like Roosevelt elk that lives in the thicker coastal forests of the Pacific Northwest. I have personally killed red hartebeest and gemsbok in Africa with a 4570. I shot that gemsbok at about 30 yards and it worked great. Now, there's also nothing wrong with using a 308 at closer range either, right? With the right bullets, put the bullet in the right spot, that animal is going to go down. But if you are in a situation where you might need to take a shot on an animal past 100 or 150 yards, well, you definitely need to go with the 308 out of these two cartridges. Yes, the 308 is not as powerful as other popular elk hunting cartridges, right? Like 7 Rim Mag, 30-06, 300 Win Mag, but it still works great on elk and similar size game at appropriate ranges when using premium bullets. Randy Newberg has taken piles of elk with the 308 over the years. A 165 grain Nosler partition is a wonderful choice out of that cartridge on game like elk. No elk will go very far at all after taking a hit through the heart and or lungs, even with something like a 308. You will not have quite as much reach with a 308 as you would a 30-06 or a 300 Win Mag, but it will still work. And I think it's definitely a better choice for something past 100 yards than a 4570. But what if you're hunting game like brown or grizzly bear? What if you hunt in Alaska or Canada and you want a heavy-hitting cartridge just in case you find yourself on the wrong end of a brown or grizzly bear attack? Once again, both will work. Choosing the better one here really depends on the situation. The 4570 is one of the best bear defense cartridges available. That is certainly what I would like to carry and what I would recommend on a hunt where shorter ranged shots are very likely. There's a reason why the Marlin guide gun is so popular among hunters and outfitters in Alaska. There are few other rifles I would rather have in my hands if I had to deal with a charging brown bear. Now, the 308 will also work great on a bear hunt, right? Even a brown bear hunt, but it's just not at the top of the list of recommended cartridges for hunting those bears. But just like with elk, you put a good bullet through the vitals of a bear, it will bring it down quickly. If you foresee yourself in a situation where you need to take a shot at a bear outside the ideal range of a 4570, some would recommend going up to something more powerful, right? 300 Win Mag, 338 Win Mag, 375. That's really between you and your outfitter. Some guys like Phil Shoemaker have said that as long as you can shoot it well, something like a 308 is great. They have no issues with you using it, and indeed would rather you use a 308 you can shoot well instead of a 300 Win Mag or a 338 you cannot shoot well. Now, in that same vein, what if you want a really heavy-hitting cartridge ideally suited for hunting thick-skinned, dangerous game like Cape buffalo? Now, the 4570 is technically a big bore round in the broadest sense of the word, and I would definitely use it over a 308 if I had to pick one of just these two cartridges. But I don't recommend using the 4570 for hunting thick-skinned, dangerous game. For one thing, the details matter, but in many cases in Africa, the 4570 falls short of the minimum energy required for legally hunting thick-skinned, dangerous game like buffalo. And in some countries, they have a 4,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy minimum. 4570 does not even come close to that. I would never recommend anyone do anything that is not legal. But to be fair, not every country in Africa has that 4,000 foot-pounds of energy minimum, and not everybody agrees with me on this subject either. Several hunters have successfully and cleanly taken Cape buffalo with a 4570, especially with so-called Magnum 4570 loads from certain companies like Buffalo Boar and Garrett. I think the 4570 is a great cartridge, but I think there are good reasons not to hunt buffalo with it, aside from that legal requirement I just mentioned. I have written a comprehensive article explaining why I think that is the case. Link to that article is in the show notes. Switching gears, if you want a great cartridge for sheep, mountain goat, tar hunting, where you need an effective cartridge with manageable recoil and a lightweight and easy-to-carry rifle, well, I think the 308 Winchester is once again a superior choice for that sort of hunt. That's because of the advantages the cartridge has in its trajectory, wind deflection, retained kinetic energy, and just the fact that it recoils less and is much easier to accurately place shots at several hundred yards downrange with it. The 308 is not nearly as popular as other cartridges like a 270 or a 6.5 Creedmoor for mountain hunting, but it will darn sure work in the right hands. Okay, so with all that said, I think the 4570 and the 308 are both wonderful rifle cartridges, ideally suited for a diverse array of hunting situations. I'd steer you towards a 308 in general if you're looking for a better all-around cartridge that works great both up close and at longer range on medium and even big game. The same is true for those who want a lighter recoiling round, who want the best selection of ammo, or if you prefer to hunt with a bolt-action or a semi-automatic rifle. Likewise, I'd recommend the 4570 for hunters unlikely to shoot at game past 100, maybe 150 yards, as well as those who prefer lever-action rifles, and for those who just want a really handy, easy-to-carry rifle. The 4570 is also a superior choice for those who want or need lots of power out of a big-bore rifle for a close-range situation where speed is of the essence. Like I mentioned, I own rifles in both cartridges, and I have had a lot of success afield with each one. In fact, those rifles in 308 and 4570 are among my favorites, and I would have a tough time discarding one in favor of the other. So really, there's no reason why you can't own and hunt with both like I do either. Just use each one of them in the areas that I recommended, and you should have great success with them afield. As usual, I have written a detailed article about these cartridges for the Big Game Hunting blog. There is a link to that article in the show notes if you want to check it out. I've also put links to ammo recommendations for both the 308 and the 4570 in the show notes too. The same is also true with other accessories like hearing protection, slings, scopes, etc. Check out those URLs to learn more. Don't forget to complete the listener survey by 23 March either. That link is also in the show notes. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.